whenever possible, clamp the ruler. ठीक है? When measuring vertical heights, make sure that the ruler is held perpendicular to the base. When measuring horizontal heights, make sure that the ruler is perfectly horizontal. अच्छा, अगर फॉर एग्जाम्पल मेरे पास यूं रूलर लगा हुआ है और लेट्स सपोज वो कोई रीडिंग्स ले रहा है वर्टिकली, हाउ डू आई मेक श्योर दैट इट इज हॉरिजॉन्टल? इसका एक तरीका तो ये होता है कि व्हाट आई डू इज आई टेक अनदर रूलर and I take these readings at different points. और हर केस में मेरी जो यहाँ पे रीडिंग है ना वो सेम आनी चाहिए. अगर तो मेरी हाइट ऑफ द रूलर सेम आ रही है तो इसका मतलब है कि जो ये वाला रूलर है ना ये हॉरिजॉन्टली पड़ा हुआ है. ठीक है? How to make sure that the vertical height that you're taking is correct? Use a set square. बस set square सीख लो. ये रूलर है तो रूलर को ऐसे रखोगे. Make sure that the set square is perpendicular to the base and aligned with the side. So this will give you obviously the fact. This will give you the assurity kg the ruler is standing vertical. Then horizontal में you could use a spirit level or you could use the method that I just talked about. If you're measuring long distances, use a trunnion wheel or a pedometer. ठीक है? Pedometer is something that will count the number of steps that you take and then you multiply it with the length of your step. If you're using a tape measure, it is always suggested to go for repeated readings. Now, if you want to measure the length of a pendulum, what you need to take in account for is number one cheese. Length of the pendulum is the thread and half of the bob. इस छोटी सी चीज को प्लीज मत भूलिएगा. ये जो आपकी रेडियस ऑफ द बॉब होता है. ठीक है? उसके अलावा when you want to measure the length of the pendulum, please make sure that the ruler is perpendicular again using the set squares and everything. You could probably also clamp it and then make sure that with the set square it is perpendicular. When you're measuring the time period of the pendulum, अच्छा इसमें एक अच्छी चीज क्या है? To always make sure that you time it for more than 10 oscillations. So 10 or more oscillations, number one. Number two क्या है? Make sure that when you're timing it, if it is very hard to count where the oscillation is starting or ending, you could always record it and play back and use a slow motion version of it to count the oscillations and the time. So that's always a meta. अगर कहीं पे भी आपको लगता है ना कि it's very hard to see when the oscillation is starting, when the oscillation is ending, और आपको लगता है कि इस situation में oscillations count करना बड़ा मुश्किल होगा, so then the suggestion is to record it and playback में देख लें. अच्छा, उसके अलावा when you're using a stopwatch, please make sure that your readings that you're taking, that readings are written to 1 decimal place or 2 decimal place, depending upon the stopwatch. तो आपको तो जो टाइम दिया होगा ना, आपने उस टाइम के मुताबिक उसको देखना है. इसमें जो इंटरेस्टिंग चीज ये होती है कि अगर आपने अपना रिएक्शन टाइम कम करना है तो आप ये भी कर सकते हैं. You could ask 2 people to conduct that experiment instead of 1. So one could be just operating the stopwatch and the other could be, setting the pendulum in motion and things of these sort. Here, if you want to record the level of the liquid or water, always remember water ke case mein you take the lower meniscus, mercury ke case mein you take the upper meniscus, and if there is a colorless liquid and you want to read it off, you could always put a dye in it and that increases the visibility. Ticket tape timer generally बहुत कम ही इसके सवाल आते हैं. You have a tape जिसके ऊपर dots लगे होते हैं. अगर इन dots की length increase कर रही है, distance between the dots is increasing, then the object is accelerating. If it is decreasing, the decelerating. If it is remaining the same, then the object is moving at a constant speed. अच्छा, इसके अलावा heat के case में what are the general things that you should be covering? So सबसे पहले तो whenever you have a heat experiment, you have to always ensure कि आपकी सबसे core जो assumption होती है heat के experiments में ये होती है कि जो heater heat provide कर रहा है, all of that heat is being taken by the object. And if you need to ensure that, then you need to make sure that not a lot of heat is lost to the surrounding. You do that by covering the container, by insulating the container, providing it with lagging. You should be stirring the water so that the heat is uniformly distributed. Then this is what I talked about. Wait for the highest or steady temperature after you stop heating. ये एक बड़ा important point है, बार बार इसको वो पूछ लेते हैं, test कर लेते हैं. And a lot of times, if you want to maintain constant temperature, instead of using a Bunsen burner, use a water bath, because a water bath has a larger range. So if you take, instead of a water bath, you take an oil bath, तो oil bath की एक तो range भी ज़्यादा होगी, and because oil bath के अंदर the entirety of the fluid is at the same temperature, so when you place a beaker inside it, you ensure that उस पूरे के पूरे जो beaker है उसको जो heat मिल रही है वो evenly मिल रही है, because it's not getting from a single source, but rather उसको heat हर तरफ से मिल रही होती है, क्योंकि आप ये पानी होता है, पानी के अंदर आपने उसे डुबो दिया, पानी ऊपर भी है नीचे भी है, all of the water is at same temperature. Whenever you're taking thermometer readings, उसमें क्या करना है? Thermometer को clamp stand में लगाएं. The reading on the thermometer should be facing you. The clamp should not be obscuring the reading. ये बड़ा important चीज है. Thermometer should not be touching the sides, because if it touches the side, if it touches the bottom, then obviously जो bottom और जो sides होती हैं, they are colder as compared to the center. और क्योंकि they are constantly losing heat to the surrounding. So आपकी जो thermometer की reading होगी वो पूरे के पूरे fluid से थोड़ी सी lower temperature पे होगी. Then make sure that 1/3 or half of the thermometer is immersed, and then make sure that there is no parallax error when you're reading the thermometer. When you're taking the time for heating and cooling, again uske andar you have to look at the thermometer, you have to look at the stopwatch. Okay? So the key advice here is, please keep the timer close to the apparatus, so that when you're reading the thermometer, you can also see what is happening on the stopwatch, and you know when to start, when to stop. Okay? If you want to use two people, explain what those two people are going to be doing and how those two people doing their job separately increases the accuracy of the experiment. Obviously, if you want to read a stop clock and that stop clock is not digital, then the parallax error is something that needs to be taken care of. Acha. Now, when we're talking about light experiments, उसमें mainly दो तरह के आते हैं. So either you have a ray tracing experiment or you get a focal lens or lens की experiment. Whenever you have a ray tracing experiment, अब इसके अंदर कुछ चीजें हैं. Ray tracing के लिए ना, we use these things called optical pins. So you have to make sure that these optical pins, when you're connecting them, they need to be 5 centimeters apart. Okay, number one. Number two, when you need to draw lines, those lines should be drawn with fine sharp pencil. Then the pins should be vertical. अच्छा, अगर आपने ये देखना है कि ये pin vertical है या नहीं है, so what you do is you look at the bottom of the pin to be aligning with the next pin. So जैसे मिसाल के तौर पे ये मेरे पास एक पेन है, मैंने एक पिन यहाँ पे लगाई, एक पिन मैंने आगे लगाई. जब मैं पिछली वाली पिन से देख रहा हूँ ना, तो होगा क्या कि पिछली वाली पिन के सामने अगली वाली पिन छुप जाएगी, हाइड कर जाएगी. So what will happen is, when I'm looking at the pin, so for example, what I do is I take this pencil and I take this pen. There is a way that I can place this pen in such a manner that this second pen gets hides behind the first pen. So this is what you're doing with the optical pins also. How to make sure that the optical pins are aligned? You look at the bottom of the pin and see if the bottom of the pin is hiding the pin next to it. And similarly, all of the pins should be hiding behind that first pin that is exactly in front of you. So this is, if you don't get this, I would suggest Google optical pins in ray diagrams and you will understand what this, what I'm talking about. Then, if you want to look at the angles, always remember, देखो जब आपके पास angle of incidence होता है, so either you could take this as line or you could take this as an angle. Why would I take a larger angle as compared to a smaller angle? The reason why I would take a larger angle is because larger angle may percentage uncertainty in my value decreases. Percentage uncertainty किस वजह से? Due to experimental error. किस एक्सपेरिमेंटल एरर की, अगर मैं रीडिंग ले रहा हूँ, रीडिंग बहुत छोटी है ना, तो उसके अंदर एरर के चांसेस बढ़ जाते हैं, लेकिन अगर वो रीडिंग बड़ी है तो उसमें एरर के चांसेस कम होते हैं. सो दैट इज यूज लार्ज एंगल्स. ये है, if you're measuring time, use large amount of time so that human reaction error छोटा हो जाए. If you're measuring angles, use large angles ताकि D से reading लेना आसान हो. Then last but not the least, repeat with different angles if you are interested in calculating the refractive index of the medium. फिर उसके बाद ray box के लिए use a darkened room, use a narrow slit which is giving you a single beam of light, and make sure that the beam strikes the mirror ka center, the center of the glass, because it's entirely possible if it's hitting here, it might just go out, and that's not entirely what we want. Now, when you're looking at the focal lens, again, I've talked about this in detail in the first bit, so I won't go over this. And the last thing that we wanted to do today was electrical experiments. इनमें क्या क्या मसले आते हैं? सबसे पहली जो चीज ये है कि if you're given a manual meter, not a digital meter, manual meter को हमेशा टैप जरूर करना, because वो टैपिंग से होगा क्या कि if the needle is stuck anywhere, it gets free. Number one, tap the meter to avoid sticking of the needle. Then secondly, make sure that the connections are clean and tight. Avoid parallax error in the reading, again, making sure that the line of sight is perpendicular to the reading on the meter. Here, always check polarities. Agar aap, for example, if there is a diode involved, then it is very important to check the polarity of this battery, because otherwise you will not see anything on the battery. Switch off the current when not making a reading. Ye bada important hai. Why? Because please remember, all of the questions that we do, we assume our resistors to be ohmic conductors. Ohmic conductor ki kya assumption hoti hai? That the temperature is not changing, which is why the resistance is not changing. Whereas we know that in actual conductors, as the temperature increases, the resistance also increases. So if we want our things to behave as ohmic conductors, we don't want the apparatus to heat up. And because we don't want the apparatus to heat up, that is why we take the reading, that is why we close the readings, close the battery in between the readings. This is also one of the reasons why we don't use very large current. We try to make sure that the current is small so that the heating effect is not too high. Third, use sensitive meters. When measuring resistance, use low current and voltage to avoid heating and changing the resistance you are measuring. अगर हीट अप हो जाएगी तो रेजिस्टेंस चेंज हो जाएगी, वो आपकी सारी की सारी जो एक्सपेरिमेंट है वही खराब हो जाती है. फिर मेक श्योर कि अगर आपके पास एक डिजिटल नहीं है, एक दूसरे वाला एमीटर है, इट्स अ मैनुअल वन, मेक श्योर दैट द डिफ्लेक्शन इज ऑलमोस्ट फुल स्केल. सो व्हेन यू वांट टू चूज के यू नो व्हिच मैनुअल एमीटर और वोल्टमीटर शुड आई बी यूजिंग, always go for the ammeter जिसके अंदर reading is covering 3/4 and more of the scale. ठीक है? So अगर आपने 0 से 5 के दरमियान की रीडिंग लेनी है, तो आपका जो स्केल होना चाहिए वो 0 से 5 का ही होना चाहिए, ना कि 0 से 50 का हो. जिसका मतलब ये है कि 0 से 50 के केस में रीडिंग सिर्फ इसी एरिया में आ रही होंगी और ये बाकी सारी एरिया जो है वो इग्नोर हो रहा होगा. So that's not use of the instrument correctly. फिर उसके बाद लास्ट चीज क्या है, if the current is too high, obviously things could burn, fuse could melt, power supply could trip, and you could damage the ammeter or the needle of the ammeter. Last but not the least, when we're talking about what is the advantage of a digital versus analog, so digital mein you don't have any parallax error, needles don't stick, it is easier to read, easier to change the range, and you have lower resistance. So all of those things are things that are advantageous when you're reading a digital ammeter and as compared to an analog one. So this was, I tried my level best to do justice to a 1 hour session on alternative